Okay, welcome everyone. This year, one of the things that I wanted to do in the Monday Zoom was to encourage us in how we can teach composition and improvisation to our students, and for any students here to be inspired to compose and improvise more. So we're going to be covering this topic a fair few times during the Monday Zooms, and Christopher Norton has very kindly agreed to come and share with us some insight into his compositional processes. For those who don't know him, he's written like 1,000 million works in his 21 short years of life in so many different styles, and he's joining us at 6 a.m. in the morning from Canada. So with no further ado, thank you, Mr. Norton, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. So, composition processes. That's a little bit of a burst of one of my best known compositions, which is on the Associated Board Grade 2 at the moment, I believe, Intercity Stomp. And I've been composing since the age of 14, so it's a good 7 years now. And I started by listening to loads and loads of music. I was very, very interested in all kinds of classical music in particular, not so much popular music as a child. And gradually it started to come out as compositions of my own, but it was quite a late stage. I hadn't really thought about it. I just enjoyed playing other people's music, and up to a good standard. I mean, at the age of 16, I was doing the Samuel Barber Sonata. I did a Prokofiev concerto with the New Zealand Symphony when I was 19. So I did quite high level piano playing, but I was a voracious listener, and I still am, in fact. And I think that's one of the things I always say to students is listen to lots of things, and it doesn't matter what it is, try and find out what you are really drawn to by other composers. I think that's a good starting point for trying your own thing, is to kind of realize which areas you particularly feel drawn to, if you like. What I thought would be quite interesting for you to hear was my early compositional process. This is a piece from 1975, just a snippet of it, called Bush Pieces for Piano. I liked writing pictorial pieces at that stage. In fact, I still do quite like it. And one of my most popular pieces at the moment is called Rainforest, for instance, from the Connections series, book 3. But this is an early example of a piece. This is what the manuscript looks like. In fact, my own publishing company is about to put this out. But you'll be quite surprised to hear what this sounds like, I think. So here's a picture of New Zealand bush, or bush anyway, and some of the music, and this is what it sounds like. So you can tell straight away that that's a kind of linear style, if you like, and lots of chords built up in fourths, which I've always liked, and lots of major seconds as well. Because one of the things I'm fascinated by with composition, with students in particular, is how people are drawn to particular intervals or particular types of figurations, some contrapuntal, which this is, some play very chordally and so on. But this is typical of the things that I was drawn to write when I was quite a bit younger. And here's another piece which was written this is amazing, this is when it was written in 1969. So how old was I in 1969? Let's have a look. Anyway, I was born in 53, so I was 16. So this is written when I was 16. In fact, this has just come out through 80 Days Publishing as well. And it's a piece for cello and piano called Rumba. And so on. So you can tell that's a very different style. So I was starting to kind of get interested in popular music at the same time as immersing myself in classical music. And this is very characteristic of a certain strain of what I do. And again, I'm saying to composers, if you've got more than one interest, if you like the symphonies of Martineau, which I did, but also like Jobim, which I did, it is possible that you can end up writing in both styles. And what I've done is trying to kind of cast my net as wide as possible. So I came to the UK in 1977. This is a long time ago now, but I was published quite quickly by Universal Edition in London. And the first major book I had out for piano was called Carol Jazz, which some of you may have come across. So it's a slightly blurred picture here. It's from their website. But this was an interesting case because this is using composition from an improvisational point of view. What I did was took existing carol tunes and improvised pieces around them. And this book has stood the test of time quite well. It's about grade 8 in level, I would say. And one of the most popular pieces in it is Silent Night. It's a rather blurred picture of the music, I'm afraid, but you'll get to hear it from a student performance on YouTube. And I think still that I'm very proud of this, if you like. And what I was doing was at the time, I was exploring jazz quite a bit. And so there's a lot of jazz voicings in this. And also the idea of believing in your own melody lines, if you like, overlaid on top of a tune which exists already. And again, for students, it's quite a good idea to say to them, why don't you try and do something based on a folk song or in this case, a carol, and see what you come up with if you can sort of add something around it, if you like. So this is Silent Night from um, Carol Jazz. Now, there's a rather blurred picture of the music. You'll get an idea when you hear it, what it's about. And here's my tune back. So I still really like that. That was quite an early attempt at trying to do something which was expanded further in the concert collections, in particular, into doing entire books where other tunes are the basis for compositions. So it really is a nice blend of known tunes and improvisation and composition, in fact. Now, Microjazz came along shortly after that because I was approached by Booz and Hawkes. Some of you may know that Universal Edition, who are a very well-known publisher, asked me to write a set of graded pieces in popular styles, and I did. And then the person who asked me to write it left the company. And so I had a whole lot of manuscripts in my bottom drawer for probably 2 years. When I met with Booz and Hawkes, they realized that there was something very marketable sitting there, and they called it Microjazz. It wasn't my suggestion, it was theirs because they published Microcosmos by Bartok, and they thought it would be a nice companion series, if you like, to have something which was more popular in style, but also called micro. And this drew on everything. I played you an early piece which was kind of more atonal. I played you something which was like a jazzy piece, and then the rumba, if you like, is in a popular style. Microjazz really covered the whole range. And when I look back at it, I've just been recording videos of Microjazz for my YouTube site for the first time, weirdly. And I'm amazed by the sort of range of styles I decided to go for. So there's a whole lot of these, 3 collections plus 2 beginner books, also 3 books of duets. In fact, now 5 collections, because books 4 and 5 have come out recently as well. And just to give you a couple of snippets of these, because it's interesting to look at the compositional processes, this is probably the most popular piece I've written in my entire set of pieces I've written, Strutton. But what was interesting about these was I was in bands at the time, and so I had very much a sort of rhythm section aspect involved. And years after I wrote the pieces, I ended up having tracks done to them, and they still sound really good. And Strutton, which is this one here, I'm going to just show you me playing on the piano here. Very straightforward piece. And so you can tell I'm starting to jam on it already, but when you actually put the track with that, so that's got like a big band playing with it and comping guitar. And so students who are learning these pieces, this is an interesting point, can actually take the backing track and try and write their own piece on top of the backing track. And I was whether to say to them, here's an existing piece with a chord structure which is very straightforward. Why don't you take that bass line and try and write your own piece above this as a starting point for writing something in a particular style. That's from Microjazz Collection 1. From Microjazz Collection 3, one of the pieces I'm most proud of, and this looks really weird. If you look at the music of this, you think, what on earth is this stylistically? And if I just play a little bit on the piano for you of this, it sounds like this. Can you tell that's quite a kind of funk style, and in fact influenced by the fact that I was playing in a band, a big soul funk band at the time in Britain, which played music in this kind of style. But when you actually put the backing track to this, you suddenly realize where it's come from. So these are in very different styles from each other, and they're only 2 pieces from a collection of probably 60 or 70 pieces all told, now expanded to over 100 because of the 4 and 5 books. What's interesting as well, my compositional process is the same, because I had to write 2 new books last year and during the pandemic, which have just come out. Microjazz Collections 4 and 5. So 40 years later, I've added to the series with two other books and discovered the same thing, that I'm still basically sitting at the piano and thinking, what did I write this morning, if you like, starting from a rhythm, starting from a little row of notes or whatever. I'm basically a melodic writer, so I do start with melody as the opening thing I'm interested in. But I'm also, of course, interested as well in the harmonization aspect. And you notice that there aren't that many chords in these pieces, but they are quite interesting chords. So I'm quite interested in the idea that you can use chords which are slightly more far out. I mean, if you look at this Intercity Stomp, is going to be the kind of almost gospel-like chords. But this other piece here, you've got these parallel chords, but also these chords, which are all based again in fourths. So again, it's rather hard to say what my compositional process is, except I like to start with a good idea and then try and work it very logically. And I'm going to be talking about that before we finish today in relation to assessing student compositions, because what I've discovered, there's a very interesting point about student composition, and that is nearly every student I've come across who writes something starts with a good idea. It's a funny thing to say, but I haven't discovered many students who don't come up with a good idea when they start. What the weaknesses tend to be is how you continue with the idea. In other words, what you do with your idea is a significant thing after that. But actually coming up with a little memorable tune or an idea is something which most students can do, I think. So we'll come back to that anyway. I began to go back to writing more complex pieces and more sophisticated pieces with the Prelude series, and two of the Preludes are on the associated board at the moment. As you know, Pop Bossa in grade 7 and Jingo in grade 8. There are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 books of Preludes now, and this comes back to the same idea. This is the Pacific Preludes I'm thinking of particularly, and Eastern Preludes, of doing pieces which are my own compositions, which are based on existing tunes, and which really are improvisations on those tunes. And so one of the pieces in Pacific Preludes is called Chelito Lindo, which some of you may know, and this is rhythmic, pianistic, and jazzy, and quite interesting to have a look at. So look at the music of this. You can see this is getting more complex. But I'm doing the same thing. I'm starting with an idea, which is, I think, quite a nice... This opening idea here, which is mine, and you get to bar 5 in the music and you discover that the tune which I'm basing it on, Chelito Lindo, has started to appear in a way, but I'm basically doing a fantasy all based around this existing tune. So here's what this sounds like, a Mexican tune. Improvisation. So you notice that's very tightly tied together with the motif which I start with, and I'm doing some nice free improvisation as well, which goes further from the key. But there's a lot of compositional processes going on that, which all based around an existing tune. So I'm not sure. I mean, we can have questions at the end, which you can ask me more about those processes. But hopefully, you can see them on the paper, on the screen, if you like, how my mind kind of works. So let's go on and connections. Now, I wanted to this is a major thing to mention to you again, because in fact this came out in 2007 and is gradually uh, getting known all over the world. But it's Microjazz times 11. In other words, I did 3 volumes originally of Microjazz. This actually is 10 volumes with up to 30 pieces in each volume. So there's over 300 pieces in these books, all of which have free backing tracks and are also available in MIDI, and are also available on something called Superscore. Now, I'm just going to show you something which you may be amazed by. Let's have a look. I'm going to share something else on my screen. Okay, and not that, but if I just, I've gone onto my iPad now, and something called Superscore. And here's Jingo, which is actually the piece on grade 8. And look at this. So this actually is an iPad app which contains rock preludes and Latin preludes, also all of connections. And on it, you can actually have the left and right hand separated. You can play the backing track without the piano. In other words, the whole thing can be mixed. If you look at the parts here, you can actually see what all the parts are, and you can switch them off. So you can actually have just rock organ and charang lead, or just fingered bass, or whatever. And you can play the piece at any speed as well. So I'm just saying that that's quite an interesting thing to know about, if you like, that exists. So anyway, connections is all on that particular platform as well, as what I'm saying, and that's what they look like. And here's one of the pieces from Connections, which has been incredibly popular. It's a gospel swing piece, and again, looking at the compositional side of this is a very straightforward little tune. It's an E flat major. It's interesting, and there's a lot of imitation between the hands, which students like. So you've got which I like. It's quite a feature of my work. I'm always looking for chances to do imitative work between the hands, and it's in a very specific style. And if you get the backing track, you'll hear that it is in a gospel swing kind of style. But here's from my YouTube channel, In the Spirit, from Connections 4.
Are you sharing something with us, because we can't hear it, Mr. Norton?
Okay, let me just look at that again. You hearing that? Okay, now you can see the music all right, can you?
We can still see Jingo, maybe because you're still sharing your iPad.
Yeah, okay, let me just unshare it and then share again. Wait a second. There we go. And share. There we go. That'll do it. How's that? So here's Jingo. Sorry, here's In the Spirit again. If I just go back a screen. Yeah, it's the trouble when you have multiple screens. How about that? Now, in terms of compositional process, one thing that's interesting about that is that it's a very pentatonic piece. It's got major pentatonic as a kind of basis of a lot of it, and that's one thing which I've discovered. I'm a very pentatonic composer, and therefore you might say quite a folk composer deep down. That I'm drawn to folk music, and I'm drawn to pentatonic scales as well. So that's just worth mentioning. I don't use a lot of jazz scales, and by my work I do mostly use pentatonic scales. Um, so that's from Connections 4, and let's just move on. And then this is Microjazz Collections 4 and 5, and this is where the compositional process continues into the modern day. I'm quite interested to see, I was quite interested to see what came out, if you like, having had a chance to revisit the whole process again of writing multiple pieces across a range of styles. And again, for students, it's always worth saying to them, it's worth trying to write pieces in a range of styles. If you like lots of different types of music, try and write in more than one style. And this is one that I particularly like, called Strawberry Soda. And I've got soul rock here as a style, but this is the piano part with the backing track playing as well. So now, one thing you've noticed there that I'm very tight with the material, if you like, that I'm using, but I'm continually varying it in subtle ways. So you look at bar 1 and bar 2, and you discover that there's a difference in bar 2 from bar 6, for instance, and difference in bar 7 from bar 3. And all the way through, there's subtle variations going on, which means the piece is continually varied. So that's another thing which I think I like. The idea that you're not doing exact repeats, but you are doing repeats, so the listener kind of has things to hang on to. Now, I'd like to sort of sum up, having shown you these pieces from across my range, if you like, some of my approaches to composition. One of the things is a good composition must keep a good balance between familiar sounds, such as traditional harmony, and the introduction of a few original sounds. Now, I'm not saying that you kind of do this consciously, but that's what I try to do myself. Is I've got things which you can hang on to as a listener. At the same time, I'm introducing things which you might not be kind of expecting. Intercity Stop's a great example of that because of course it has this little figure, which is most of it, but at the end it goes into this. Back to my fourth chords again, and I don't know where I've got that from, but it just felt right to have something in which you're sort of throwing something else into the mix, if you like, which stops the piece from just being a pastiche or just being all one idea all the way through, if you like. So that's the first thing. A good composition must keep a balance between familiarity and novelty, if you might say. I mean, it's a very common sense thing to say, but I think it's worth saying. Secondly, I do like to rove about quite widely, from impressionistic and pictorial to rumba, jazz ballad to swing, funk and calypso, gospel to rock. And I love the idea that you can actually go very wide and even say to students, you know, why don't you just try something completely abstract or do something which is called butterfly or a pastoral day or whatever. Just take a pictorial image, if you like, and start. Or say, let's try and do something in a calypso style and listen to something calypso and then use that as a jumping off point. So roving about widely, I think, is another thing which is my approach. I like pieces wherever possible to have a groove. Now, this is an interesting point to make, a certain rhythmic style that a drummer would instantly recognize. I've worked with lots of drummers over the years, and my pieces, certainly when they come across them, they tend to say, oh yeah, I know where you got that from. I've written lots of musicals, by the way. There's 30 musicals altogether called micro musicals. And there was a particular piece which I really was intrigued by the style of, even though I'd written it, and said to a musician friend of mine, "Where did I get that from?" And he said, "Madness, the group Madness." I don't know if any of you remember them, but I'd forgotten that I'd been quite keen on them way back, and that kind of lodged in my mind, and there it was, a kind of Madness groove. And nothing beats a good tune. I do like the idea of trying to come up with a good tune. So these are all kind of part of my compositional approach, which I think it's worth you having. I've got a little sheet for you which includes these things, so you can see these at a glance, which you can download from the chat. Composition, the other thing is harmony should spring from the melody and are likely to include inversions, pattern-based left-hand patterns, things like, you can obviously, as well as ragtime styles, i.e. where you're playing the root and the fifth perhaps, and beats 1 and 3 and chord inversion on the other beats. So the harmony is very important for me as well. And often students write good tunes, but then they're fishing around for what the harmony should be. And I think it is great to get them really engaged with the idea of what harmonies are implied here, and don't just think they're going to be in root positions. That's a big thing to say as well, that assume that they need to know about inversions pretty early on if you're going to try and harmonize. So I always like to remain open to more experimental styles. Now, I played you a rather experimental piece at the beginning, and in fact there's a piece here from Connections which is very much more experimental in style, called Veiled in Mystery. Now if you look at the music of this for a start, I always come back to that last chord as pure Debussy, and in fact the Debussy Cello Sonata is one of the most influential pieces on my work, and Debussy in particular. But that, I think you'd agree, there's a sort of impressionist overtone to that, and a jazz overtone, and also again I'm using lots of these major seconds and fourth chords and so on. But I like the idea that I can occasionally just do something which is more experimental. I mean, it's not wildly experimental, but I still say that's very characteristic of me at a slightly more abstract level, if you like. I'm not trying to write a piece with a groove particularly. I'm just trying to write a piece which has got a kind of overall flavor created by particular harmonic combinations. So I thought you'd be interested in that, some Connections 8. And then improvisation plays a big part still for me, and so what I do is I'm improvising something and then doing an on-the-spot analysis of what has been created and what might logically follow it, because a lot of what I do is incredibly logical in terms of the material. Many students write pieces which they don't follow through logically. In other words, they've got an idea which is good, and then they do another idea and then another, never come back to the first one, or don't follow logically from the first one particularly. I'm going to demonstrate that in a moment with a student composition, but here's a recent improvised idea. This is from Microjazz Collection 5, which I worked on as an improvisation and then worked on to form a logical and coherent composition. And so this is a very recent composition, which I really like, called Frankly Speaking. Now I've got the whole score here. It's quite small, but hopefully you'll be able to sort of get a bit of an idea of what this sounds like. And this is again from the YouTube channel. So now I'm going to go on to a student composition. I do lots of judging of student composition, assessments you might say, and I thought it was quite fun to look at a student piece in the light of what you've been looking at with my pieces, to see how I bring my own compositional processes to bear on looking at a student piece. And this is a piece called Cheerful Winter Waltz. It's by an 8-year-old, and I thought it had lots of really nice things about it. And here's what it looks like. Now, you can see this is the manuscript which I got from the student. It's got moderato at the top, and it's got one sharp, that's in 3/4. And this is what it sounds like. That's it. So quite a short piece. I thought it was good, and in fact I'm going to mention the good points here. First of all, the main melody has a very clear structure. It's a 4-bar idea. If you look at the first line, answered by the same idea up an octave. So in fact the ending is slightly different, so that's rather, it's nicely structured melody straight away. It says moderato, which is good, so it's got an actual sort of suggestion for a tempo. And the harmonization is very simple but very effective. It's actually just 2 chords, G major and D7 over F sharp. So it's like 5/7 B, but used correctly. So when you get a student composition, what you're doing is looking for the good points straight away. And I thought there were lots of good points about this little piece. The second thing is things to consider. Now, there's no tempo indication. It says moderato, but in fact, I think it's quite nice. And there's no phrasing or dynamics. And so what I did on the left here is my edited version of the piece with a tempo indication and phrasing dynamics added. So just have a look at that. So you can see I've already got and I think I may have also put this mezzo forte, mezzo piano, this slight echo effect as well. And what I did as well, which I thought worked quite well, is I suggested that you play the whole piece and then you repeat the whole right hand up an octave. So straight away, that's a bit more satisfying composition because you've repeated the whole thing with a slightly different timbre, i.e. up an octave on the right hand. There's also got this nice echo effect all the way through, which I think is very effective. It does suggest, so I've done that. He hasn't actually put any dynamics in it at all. So I put MF followed by MP and then forte for the last phrase. And it's over too soon, so I suggested repeating the whole piece with the right hand up an octave. Also, I like the 6 in bar 3, these. So I made more of it and went into bar 4 with them as well. So just continue that little harmonization effect. Another thought, this piece would benefit from a B section. In other words, it sounds like it could do with perhaps going to the relative minor. And so you could actually, what I did was I took the opening piece and then using the same material, this is the important point, extended into a B section in the relative minor. So you get this. So repeat up an octave. So I think that's ended up a really nice little composition. And I just make these general points. Sometimes the tune is already fine, which this is, especially if it's in a specific, perhaps classical genre. The harmonization may also be good, which it was. What you may be looking to do for a start is add specific articulation dynamics. Now, I think students find this quite interesting because if they play a piece, often they play it with all those dynamics and articulation, but what they don't do is write it into the music. And so that's an important point. And sometimes a piece is too short and the student needs to find a way to extend the material in a straightforward and logical way. This is what we've done with this piece. Contrast is good. Now, What kind of contrast are we talking about? Well, I make contrast to dynamics for a start. So having that echo effect, and also contrast of timbre. So you actually ended up with a different octave in the right hand as well. The harmonization may be good already. What you may be looking to do is add specific articulation dynamics. It's just emphasizing these points. Sometimes the piece is too short. Try and extend it. Contrasts are good. Dynamics, register, and key. So we've got relative minor there as well. And the other thing I thought was quite fun, and I do this sometimes with students, is if they've got the finished piece, is to try and find a piece of film footage to put the piece to. And so since the Winter Olympics were all the time, I did this. So isn't that lovely? Now, here's my final points about student compositions, and hopefully you can rate them back to my composition as well. Most students' initial ideas are strong. I mean, that is a very important point to remember. Repetition is good, but after one repeat, some variation, however slight, is worth considering. In other words, suggest repetition, but don't have repetition, or literal repetition, more than once. I don't think that you start to need to do some variation after that. Assume a student's ideas about harmonization have some merit. In other words, it's interesting to probe into what they've done to see whether or not it's leading you somewhere interesting and correct, in fact, as well. So don't assume that they're harmonizing it wrong. Try harmonization with the left hand using single notes. Now, I've discovered quite a useful thing, is that if you've got someone who's not really doing good harmonization or is only using block chords in root position, try harmonizing using single notes only and see which notes sound good. Let your ear be your guide. That's a very important point. And then only add fuller chords on the left hand once the single notes sound good. This is something I've discovered time and time again works well. Break chords up into figuration depending on the style, and try to get a piece notated as accurately as possible with phrasing, articulation, dynamics included. So if somebody else is playing the piece, they need to be able to sort of understand entirely what the piece should be phrased like and what the dynamics are. Be prepared to cut. I think you know that. In other words, say keep this section for some other piece or some other time, but also be prepared to expand. So don't assume that you are necessarily going to keep all the piece. Don't presume you're not going to repeat some of the piece. Now, here's some interesting general points which you'll laugh at, but they're kind of correct. Forget everything you ever taught about theory and composition. Sarah might agree with me on this, and then as you're writing pieces, in a way, it's quite good to start with a blank slate. And I've done that myself many times where I like to sit down and I don't know what's going to come out. And sometimes it's quite experimentally, sometimes the piece in a very specific genre, sometimes it's melodically driven, sometimes it's chordally driven. Forget everything and just do the next thing. Listen to the air. Good compositions are already there, floating in space, waiting to be discovered. I hope you agree with that. That's a rather philosophical realm we're getting into here. And never stop trying to improve your concepts and understanding of music. Now, this is partly just through listening with interest and even doing a certain amount of analysis. When I was 12 years old, I sent away for copies of Tovey's Essays on Musical Analysis, all 6 volumes, and read them voraciously. And so I've always been interested in the analysis of music as well. And I don't think about it when I'm writing, but it does come out, I think, in subtle ways if you've got lots of analysis under your belt. Always be positive with students, I think is the other thing to say. So that's all I've got to say today, because I thought it'd be nice to leave a little bit of time for questions and comments. Don't forget, ChristopherNorton.com is my website for Boozy and Hawks. 80 Days Publishing is my website for my own compositions outside of Boozy and Hawks, including all of the Connections series. And then, of course, I'm very happy to see any of you on the Facebook page called Christopher Norton Composer. I think I've got coming up for 6,000 people attached to that at the moment. So there doesn't seem to be a limit on these types of pages. And then the YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to for free, has an enormous amount of stuff. In fact, I'm putting up all of the Microjazz books shortly onto that. That's called Christopher Microjazz on YouTube. You can find it easy by doing that link. So I'll stop sharing at that point and see if you want to turn your microphones on and open anything up to discussion.
Yes, I was just going to say, if anyone has a question that they wish to ask, and you don't want to appear on the live stream, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll ask it. If you would like to ask a question, and if you put up your hand, I can, put up your hand as in, use that funny thing. Then I can, I'm having trouble seeing the whole group, so maybe Peter will need to tell if someone puts up their hand to ask a question. But there's already a question here, Mr. Norton.
Yes.
And the question is, can you not touch my mouse, please? Oh, he's okay. The question is, with the iPad SuperScore, do you do everything yourself? All the technical stuff?
No, it does it all for you. I mean, it's already done. I programmed the whole thing into it. And the music follows, it turns the pages for you, which is amazing. And also, as I said, you can practice at any speed with the right hand playing and the left hand silence, and vice versa.
Does SuperScore only work with your compositions, or we can put any score into it?
No, it's quite a complex procedure, but it's got a huge catalogue in it from many publishers. My music happens to suit it particularly well because it's driven by MIDI, and so the backings which are in it are all MIDI driven, and I'm very familiar with that medium. So therefore, people can people can access all the sort of nuts and bolts of the backings, if you like. I think that's the way to put it.
So any MIDI composition that we already have, any MIDI file can be used in it?
Yeah, but it takes quite a bit of doing to actually get it into it, because it's what I'm saying is it's not something you can necessarily put stuff into yourself, but what it has is a very large library of compositions. Now, if I just share my screen once more and go onto the onto that device, there we go. Can you see that? Here it is. I'm just going to go to the main directory here. Here we go. Score library top level, and you discover, for instance, Timework Masterworks. Look, here's a piece by Clara Schumann.
We're not seeing this, Mr. Norton.
Let me just check why. Hang on, I'll stop share and then share again. Share screen. Yep. iPhone. Share. How about that? You seeing that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what it looks like. So it's got this is rather nice. It's got all the musicological things about it, which is great. And then you've got a lovely what you can do on SuperScore. You can have a performance which is a complete live performance, and it keeps to the bar lines anyway. So you get this. So you can tell that's really nice. But if I then go to the main directory structure and go to Score Library top level and go to Booz and Hawkes, and I'm going to go for one of the Latin preludes, and here's the piece from grade 7 ABRSM. There it is, Pop Bossa, with a backing track, which you can lose. You can also, by the way, change the size of the screen completely and redraws it. I've not done too well there, but you get the idea. Anyway, you can also tip it side on, so it just basically you can have one page filling up the whole screen, or it can have lots of pages on the one screen. So I'm going to stop share there for a moment. But yeah, it's very interesting. It's a free app on the iPad, and then you can purchase the products inside it. And I really like it. And as I said, I've got all of connections on it, and I've also got rock preludes and Latin preludes, which are both ABRSM pieces at the moment.
Well, you've got a few questions coming up. One is that I had, and I've actually been thinking about you all week, as Ed Sheeran has got a supposed allegation of borrowing.
Yeah.
While I don't believe it, because I think people just want to share fame, it did raise the question. You've said many times in these lectures, I was inspired by X, Y, and Z. So if we're encouraging our students, at what point do we say, this is how much that you can be inspired by something, this is how much is no longer being inspiration and you need to get appropriate permissions?
Well, I think, in fact, students can be encouraged to do things which are like other pieces, but since they're only doing them within the confines of the studio, you don't need to be too worried about that. You just, even if it sounds really like something else, it doesn't matter too much at that stage. But it's the only way to get to know how the nuts and bolts work, I think, is to try and do things which are quite like other things. So I wouldn't say copyright is a problem for, at that student level, but they need to write, if you like, in order to get to sharpen up their own way of doing things. So I think that's the way to put it, isn't it?
Casey's asking, what program do you use for your note input when you're composing?
I use two programs actually. I use Sibelius and Finale. And what I tend to do quite often is I play a piece in Logic and then spit the music of that out and then or save it. I might even save it in MuseScore on the way through, but I export as an XML and then bring it in to Sibelius in particular, because Sibelius is very easy to use, I think, and I've just got used to how it works. Everybody gets used to programs that they know down there. It's a bit like saying to somebody, you use Microsoft Word, I want you to use a different word processor. They hate the idea. So most people stick with what they know. But if you haven't got onto something, I think Sibelius is a good starting point. It's quite expensive, and MuseScore is definitely worth thought. My own granddaughter asked me this week, she's doing some compositional project, and she said, what do you suggest for music notation software? And I said, try MuseScore, because it's either free or very cheap. And it's a great way of starting.
It's limited to 16 staves, but if we're composing for single line instruments, there's no issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now there's I might ask Claire's question first, because it's more directly at composition, and then I'll get to Kathy. So Claire's is, do you find that the composition process is the same for other instruments as piano, or do you use a different approach?
It's the same in the sense that you're trying to write good melodies with strong harmonic underpinning, if you like. Obviously, the technique of instruments starts to become significant. Like I've written major pieces for flute and piano, or cello and piano, and you get to know through working with other players things you can do using harmonics or using double stopping, or whatever it might be. So there's a whole raft of interesting things connected to other instruments, which I think are worth exploring. And using sample technology is good in that sense, because of course you can get very realistic sounds. One thing I've done recently, if I just share my screen once again and type in the word undulations, is I've written a whole lot of pieces for piano, and here's one, Coronte. Listen to this. I think it's going to come up. Here we go. So that's a piece, a very characterful piano piece, but it's arranged for wind sextet. And it's using Note Performer, which is a very good bank of sounds, which is attached to Sibelius. So you use Sibelius, but it actually produces much higher quality sounds. And I think you'd agree. I played that to a musician friend of mine a couple of days ago, and he said, oh, which group are you using? I said, no, that's not a group. That's Note Performer inside Sibelius. So it's so realistic that even musicians can be caught out and think that's the real thing. So that's a great way. I should emphasize, by the way, that if you're writing pieces for other combinations, that it's great to use sample sounds to work with. In other words, work with sounds which are as close as possible to what you're writing for, because it makes you think of different things. I've discovered that if I'm writing something for flute and piano, I like to work with the flute sound. And because I don't tend to write away from the piano. I mean, I tend to write with the sound in front of me. Some people, Benjamin Britten famously wrote entire pieces at his desk, but I have to really be with the sound source in front of me. It's just the way I am.
Now, Kathy has asked, what is the publishing process like?
The publishing process it's a very complicated area because I wrote Microjazz, as I said, and it sat in my bottom drawer for 2 years. In other words, you have to find somebody who understands what you've done, if you've done anything any good, and then it's just down to luck. And on top of that, of course, it's a very strange world. I've been talking about this quite a bit recently because I publish other people's music as well as my own with 80 Days, just here and there, and I, I um, I muse on the structure of publishing arrangements in classical publishing in particular, because usually what happens is you get 10% of the retail price and the publisher gets 90. And I've thought that is hardly justified in the modern world, because they ask you to do all your own marketing and all your own typesetting. It should really be closer to 50-50 at the most. And in fact, when you get into media music, like library music, which I've done a lot of, you get 50%. You don't get 10%. So I'm not saying you have to accept that, but if somebody's lucky enough to land a publishing deal with a major publisher, you'll be getting 10%, and therefore you have to sell an awful lot of books to make anything like the money you would make just as a piano teacher. I've done it by selling millions of books, but again, that's 40 years of marketing is behind that. Because that's the other thing, of course, is that you can put your own things out these days very easily through something like Sheet Music Plus and just upload your own music. But how do you market it? And you have to market a lot. I read recently, I think this is a famous thing in marketing, is if something sells, you generally have to advertise it 7 times. Because people see it and then they need to see it over and over before they think, oh, that looks interesting. It isn't just a matter of putting it up once and hoping for the best. I hope that's helpful. But I mean, I'm an interesting case because I'm actually signed to a major publisher, as I have been for nearly 40 years, but I've also got my own publishing imprint. So I'm doing both. I'm doing 2 things at once, and that's quite a good way. But my own publishing imprint, I'm really doing because I like doing it. It's not because it makes particularly much money yet. And in fact, I quite like the idea of doing things which aren't for money, if you like. I just do it because I like doing it. But what we're trying to do with 80 Days, we distribute digitally. So we actually have an arrangement both through Hal Leonard in most countries, but also through Lulu, which is like Amazon. So people can have the books printed in their own country. But we expect to sell 2 or 3 of a book in a month. But what we try to do then is have 200 books and sell 2 or 3 times 200. We haven't got there yet, but that's the aim, is not to sell 200 books a month, but to sell 2 books a month times X number of titles. Because sales don't tend to be huge, they just don't, unless you are writing a piano method or something like that. So, and even then, there's lots of people trying to do it, and there's just a few who float to the top. And actually, I've always laughed about this because I'm good friends with the person who wrote Piano Adventures, Randy Faber, and I've sold something like 2 million copies of Microjazz. He sells 2 million copies a year of Piano Adventures. So it's a whole different world. But they're the it's a very, very small percentage. It's like comparing yourself as a pop music writer to Sting, who's worth $400 million. The people at the very top, it's a totally different thing. Most people struggle to make a living from music.
And sometimes I get criticized. I'm very strict on Facebook that we don't share copyright music. If we've got a question to ask, we share only a proportion of it, so that it's the problem is that we expect ourselves to make a living, but we don't always think, well, the composer and the typesetter and all those people should make their living too when we start sharing files for free. And I think it's so important, because
that's right. I'm careful not to share too much free, because you are basically, people just get used to it, and you're giving, like Spotify in a way has helped people feel as though music is a kind of cheap commodity, but in fact it means that lots of people who are putting a lot of work into it don't earn anything significant from it at all, even if they get lots of plays.
I will sneakily mention that in this Zoom room is a composer who has had a hit song, but unfortunately, due to the fact that YouTube's policies means that there's very little commission for it, and that is one of the problems with Spotify and streaming platforms, is that their commissions for the author is almost minimal.
Yeah, I regard Spotify and YouTube as marketing tools. I don't really regard them as mediums for earning money. But they are quite effective marketing tools, because, of course, people I put lots of my pieces on YouTube so people can hear what they sound like, and I have suggestions for how to play them and so on. And then people go back and buy the books, because I'm in the book industry largely, and it's still. I think you'll all agree with this. Most teachers find it a bit irritating having a piece of paper which you give to the student, and then they bring it back next week and the dog's chewed it. Having things in a book is actually quite a useful medium, even if it's just for keeping it together, if you like, for students. So I think it's like books themselves, e-books. Everybody's saying they'll take over from books, but in fact it hasn't really happened. Both exist, and if anything, the purchase of books and bookshops are getting stronger again. So I still think there's life in the book market still. And who's the person who's had the hit?
So it's actually Nika Zaharia, and she is planned to speak next month on her composition process. So I invited her to come to hear you, to see what our Zooms are like. So she's waving.
Well, I hope you don't feel as though what I'm saying is too sort of negative, Nika. But you know what I mean. In a way, you've got to think, well, if I'm getting a lot of airplay, it's got to lead. It could lead to something. It's all one can say, really. But you can't sort of say, oh, I've done it. You in a way. If you've got a song, you might find that in fact it's worth getting the sheet music out and putting that out through Sheet Music Plus as well, so people can actually play it. I mean, it's just a thought, and suddenly you realise that there's actually quite a bit of revenue can be generated from that source.
Oh, Nick, this is an idea we could get on the back of. Thank you for the suggestion. Anyway, for everybody who's in the room or listening on the live stream, that's for next month. Exciting guest speaker. And if I can convince Mr. Norton to come back, we may have him as well. So I guess it's got quite late here, and for some others it's probably getting close to lunchtime, and for Mr. Norton, who woke up very early for us, it's getting
it's breakfast time coming up. Yes, it's nice.
So after I was sick when I named today's session. In case anyone's wondering why it's called An Evening with Christopher Norton, I was like, oh, I just made a title up on the spot, and it's not very appropriate under the circumstances. But for everyone who's here, thank you so much for coming. And for those who are watching, thanks for joining us on the live stream. And of course, as ever, thank you, Mr. Norton, for sharing so much of your inspiration with us tonight and giving us some solid handles that we can use when encouraging our students to experiment in a compositional realm.
And I was saying to Sarah that it would be quite nice to do something further with student compositions. In other words, to do some assessment things where you send compositions to me, if you like, and we look at them online, live, effectively.
Oh.
I mean, it's obviously that could take quite a while, but I'm just saying, you saw from that little student composition tonight how you can subtly expand it, and then it suddenly becomes a really lovely little piece. And if they'd used that in the background for that skating sequence, people would have been writing in saying, where can I get that? And suddenly that student could be making significant media, because the most money I make from music is from media music. It's not from books. In other words, it's use of music on film and television is really, that's where the best area to be in, and computer games is another one. A friend of mine, you'll love this story, by the way. A friend of mine, he's a guitar player and trumpeter who is sort of making a reasonable living, but just doing live gigs. Joined a computer games company about 10 years ago, and in the second year, he helped write the music for Donkey Kong, and he got a £600,000 bonus. A £600,000 bonus in his second year in the operation with this company. I'm not saying that happens to everybody, but I'm just saying there's areas of music where there's a lot of money, but it's not in educational musical books particularly, or indeed with Spotify or YouTube. It's computer games and media music, which is another topic.
And that two-note melody from Super Mario and the composer's a fortune.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The coin noise. But anyway, on this, the boys recognise that they know what it is. Anyway, on that note, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Mr. Norton, for coming, and we will see you all next time. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.